3 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's a strange one, isn't it? You've got the former leader of the Labour Party and now the woman who would have been Home Secretary had Jeremy Corbyn somehow won a general election, no longer in the Parliamentary Labour Party. It's the sort of Labour equivalent, I suppose, of the Tories who are completely out of the picture, although in their case it's through no fault of their own. These people, Abbott and Corbyn, are being punished for their behaviour by the current leader of the Labour Party. That's not an opinion. That's a matter of fact. You might think they don't deserve the punishment, or that the punishment doesn't fit the crime, or even that there's no crime at all. But you can't dispute the simple fact that that's what it is. That's what has happened. And then on the other side of the House, there are empty seats where once would have sat people like Philip Hammond and Rory Stewart. I mention it just in the context of a remodelling of the political landscape, because I'm interested in what Diane Abbott's disgraceful conduct at the weekend means more broadly. And I'm not sure it means much beyond the disgusting conduct of Diane Abbott, because, I mean, Keir Starmer could hardly have acted quicker, could he? Absolutely correct decision. It's a breathtaking letter. If you're minded to ring me to tell me that because she's apologised she should be immediately reinstated, then I think I can save you tuppence. You have an inquiry or an investigation into how it happened, because I'm afraid that saying, "Oh, all the racism was in the first draft," I didn't mean to send it. That's not good enough. It's a sorry but. It's Rabian, isn't it? In its in the way that it poses more questions than it does answers. And I saw it yesterday. Do you know, I keep promising myself that I'm going to resist the urge to spend half an hour on Sunday morning scrolling through Twitter before I've got out of bed. Twice in a month now, I've ended up making national news as a consequence that I have tweeted from my pit. As my late father would have called it, tweeted from my pit. Once, when the Daily Mail pretended that I'd somehow manipulated a photograph of Suella Braverman laughing her head off at a Rwandan refugee facility, a deployment of a photograph that had also been used by a male columnist, but they didn't do that. And then yesterday, the BBC chose to report my tweets about the return of the blue tick, which we hadn't even got around to talking about, because I was fairly persuaded last week that outside of a weird world of, I don't know what you'd even call it, nobody cares. But anyway, I was scrolling through Twitter on Sunday morning and I saw this letter that she had sent to the Observer newspaper from her House of Commons office. And I actually, for a moment, thought that it was some sort of manipulation or some sort of spoof, parody, some appallingly poor taste joke. I read the original piece by Tomiwa Owolade and I found it interesting and thought-provoking. I'm not sure I agree with it completely, but the idea that racism is not a black and white issue is clearly fairly straightforward. As an Irish kid, or a kid with an Irish surname, I would get accused of being a terrorist sympathiser when I was young, in the same way that Muslim kids do now. Is that a race issue? Yeah, I think it probably is. Albeit that the perforated line between race and religion when it comes to Islam and to Judaism is something that must be borne in mind. Some of the worst racism we get into the studio is directed at Roma or the traveller community. We obviously get racism of all types. The days upon which Diane Abbott has appeared on the station see an opening of the sewers. I think that is important to mention, because the kind of racists who abuse Diane Abbott publicly and disgustingly will be feeling that all their Christmases have come at once as a consequence of her appalling intervention at the weekend. The second most virulent examples of racism in this studio occur when Sadiq Khan comes in to answer your calls and to answer your questions. I'm utterly beyond doubt that vicious abuse of Sadiq Khan is based entirely upon his ethnicity and or his religion. So the idea that, as she wrote, that Irish, Jewish and traveller people, And she certainly implied that they can't suffer from racism. I think she said that they can't suffer from racism. Shall I read you the words precisely? Tomiwa Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish and traveller people all suffer from racism. Racism is in quotes, and then the headline of the article she's responding to is quoted in full. Racism is not a black and white issue, it's far more complicated. Abbott goes on, they undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice. That's the point at which I thought I had accidentally had some magic mushrooms with my cooked breakfast. Because throughout my career trying to walk these tightropes, people who mention ginger hair in the context of conversations about racism are A, blithering idiots, and B, almost always racists. It's such a bizarre intervention for a woman of colour to make, because normally for me it's Billy Buncher-Numbers with a bulldog avatar claiming that he knows what it's like to be the victim of discrimination because he was called Ginge at school. I told you some time ago about a neighbour of ours who sat at a table at some sort of street party that Mrs. O'Brien made me go to, and claimed she knew what it was like to be a victim of racism, and she was speaking about, I forget precisely what the story was, but it was a proper vicious racist story, Stephen Lawrence kind of status story, and she claimed that because she was often the butt of Welsh jokes from her good friends, by dint of having been from Wales, then she knew exactly what it was like. And you just sit there sometimes spluttering, and you think that it's a form of white privilege or a form of detachment from the lived reality of other people. But for Diane Abbott, I mean, a tireless anti-race campaigner, the recipient probably of more racism than anybody in the history of the House of Commons, a pioneer in many ways for people of colour. And for her to bring redheads into it just sort of lost me completely. Lost me in the sense of any even vague inkling of trying to offer up a mild defence or a support of her would go straight out of the window if you were so minded. I wasn't particularly. But also lost me in the sense of what the hell is she talking about? You're comparing Jews to redheads in the context of discrimination. I think the Irish paradigm is thankfully in abeyance at the moment. The idea of anti-Irish hatred being in the mainstream in the way that, for example, anti-Muslim hatred or anti-black hatred remains in the mainstream. And sadly, over the course of the last 10 years or so, I think we've gone backwards as a society when it comes to things like that. Obviously racist people being offered slots on TV and radio and newspaper columns, the slightly cleverer ones with the public school education who know how to walk the line very, very carefully between obvious racism and dog whistle racism. Dog whistle racism being a rather helpful turn of phrase because you blow the whistle and not everyone can hear it. So you can conceivably argue that you haven't blown the whistle at all. But Chummo over there knows exactly who you're talking to and exactly what you're talking about when you unveil your breaking point poster or talk about people speaking foreign on trains or whatever or call for all Muslims to be held responsible for acts of terror, then you know what you're dealing with, or even Muslim bans. So I think we've gone backwards. Certainly gone backwards when it comes to things like the Sewell Report, claiming that there is no such thing as systemic racism in a country where pretty much every police service is absolutely riddled with it. But I digress, because traditionally, historically, recently, Diane Abbott has been on the right side of history in these matters. Just for the avoidance of any doubt whatsoever, she could not be more wrong. And she could not be more reprehensible in this comment. I heard Nick earlier, and because I had spent my early days professionally on newspapers as well, not for as long as he did, and you do wonder what the hell happened just logistically. How did it get out of her office, this letter? I haven't finished reading it, have I? I probably should. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote, and at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. Now, I think those statements are factually correct, but if you're going to talk about Jewish people in particular, or Roma people, travellers as she calls them, being somehow exempt from the reality of racism, you're pretty much glossing over the bloody Holocaust, aren't you? You're pretty much just swerving it, or forgetting it, or ignoring it. Never mind the no dogs, no blacks, no Irish posters of recent British history. The Holocaust was the thing that jumps to mind, right? For everybody reading this. And at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. So, I mean, this sounds a little odd. I have to explain this to newly arrived colleagues and younger members of the production staff. Making the phones ring is not really the difficult part of my job. It's very, very easy to make the phones ring. Is there anybody old out there feeling poorly? It's a great way to make the phones ring. And back in the day, certainly when I started here, anybody a bit racist out there who thinks they're not allowed to say what they want in this country anymore without being called a racist? Why don't you give me a ring and say something a bit? I mean, it's easy to get the phones. Parking tickets. Ever had a parking ticket you didn't think was fair? Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. But I don't want to do that today. I want calls that make the rest of us think. And I don't know what to think about this beyond. What the hell? What happened? What happened? So I mentioned that because my switchboard is almost full. There's one phone, line 2 there, blinking in a lonely fashion. So I'm already getting answers to questions I haven't asked yet, which is great. And hopefully we'll talk to you shortly. But I'm interested in the politics of it as well. I'm interested in whether, as a Jew, you feel that this has set the Labour Party back towards the place that Jeremy Corbyn took it, or whether Keir Starmer actually has dealt with this wholly unwelcome episode about as well as a political leader could do. You look at how long it takes Rishi Sunak to get rid of people who have done something wrong, or even to suspend people accused of doing something wrong. Starmer moves like lightning. Remember, Corbyn's out. Corbyn's out of the party. He's not standing for the Labour Party in the next general election. Again, whatever you think about the justice of that, the speed and robustness of Starmer's leadership is undeniable. And the same with Diane Abbott. She was suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party before most people had even seen the story. Certainly true of me. I think the first I saw of the story was the suspension. So I looked back and read the letter and thought that can't be real, that can't be right. But then, of course, it must be because it's been suspended. 17 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I am interested in where it comes from. I mean, lazily, I think it comes from a deep dislike of the modern state of Israel, particularly with its attitude to Palestinian people. But I do feel that it must go further than that. It must go deeper than that. Anti-Semitism is not the same as disapproval of Israeli domestic or foreign policy. So where does this come from? But of course, the fact that she's included Irish people and travellers, which I think she takes from the original article by Tomiwa Owolade, it puts some extra dimensions on the story, doesn't it? The idea that you can't suffer racism if you're Jewish or Irish or a member of the traveller community seems to me to be so obviously wrong, so horribly, horribly wrong, that I don't actually understand the point she thought she was making. So that's a question that I'd ask you as well. What is the point that the most generous and charitable reading of Diane Abbott's comments could conclude she was trying to make? Obviously she's completely carked it. She's used appalling analogies. Her language is reprehensible and completely forgiven. But I do understand the point she was trying to make. Because I don't. Do you? 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. And then if it's timely or appropriate, and it may not be, I just sense you've probably been talking about this pretty much for 24 hours on LBC. So it may be a good time to start looking at, if you like, the side issues, the attendant issues. I'm not sure. You have a particular responsibility when you present the most popular programme on the station, not to let the tail wag the dog. But if you do want to talk about how you, as an alienated Jewish Labour voter, felt about Starmer's warm welcome back to the fold, and whether or not what Diane Abbott has done has affected in any way the progress of that burgeoning relationship. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 19 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It is 22 minutes after 10, and it is one of the most disgusting things I can remember an elected politician doing in public. I speak of Diane Abbott's letter to The Observer, in which she did, I don't think there's any other way of spinning it, she compared the abuse, the racist abuse, the discrimination against Irish people, Jewish people and travellers to the prejudice experienced by redheads. And I just wonder whether she's completely taken leave of her senses, or whether there is some sort of rationale that she was trying to express, albeit that she completely failed to do so and ended up disgracing herself on a scale that, for me at least, renders it almost impossible to imagine her being allowed back into the Parliamentary Labour Party. Just a quick visit to Idiot's Corner, because we're looking at such serious territory. The reason you are struggling to get your head around it is because it was a Labour politician. If it was a Tory, you'd be down that person's throat. Yeah, I'd be calling for them to be expelled from the parliamentary party, probably. I'd certainly be applauding their suspension. I'd be describing them as disgusting and reprehensible and unforgivable. You're absolutely right. I'd be using completely different language if I was talking about a Tory politician than the language that I'm using to talk about. Oh, my bad. It's exactly the same. You muppet. David's in Borehamwood. David, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, David.
I'm absolutely appalled by what Diane Abbott has done. Two things. One, how can you possibly draft something like that and say you sent it by mistake? What's she doing with the draft in the first place?
The errors arose. For people who are not as plugged in as you are, this is her apology. And she did write, "I wish to wholly and unreservedly withdraw my remarks and disassociate myself from them," followed with, "The errors arose in an initial draft being sent. But there is no excuse, and I wish to apologise for any anguish caused." And then, don't you do all the bad stuff in the first draft, David, and then just give it a bit of an edit before you send it to anybody?
I don't write that sort of stuff.
No, I know. I don't. Well, I can't imagine anybody does until you see the evidence that they do.
What would you be doing with the draft in the first place? Number one.
Yeah.
Number two, when she says that Irish, redhead and Jews weren't confined to the back of the bus.
Yeah. But she didn't quite say that about redheads, but
yes, that's a sentiment she was saying.
Yeah, kind of.
Well, perhaps a lot of your listeners don't know that under the Moors in North Africa, Jews were forbidden from riding a horse or a donkey for fear of having their head higher than an Arab. Well, is that not racism?
I guess it is. I don't know how helpful it is in the context of the current conversation, which is about what people experience in the Western world today. So I don't think you need to go back to the Moors, for me at least. You just go back most obviously and most shamefully to the Holocaust, and
absolutely,
and then pertinently, but not as powerfully, you go back to the "No dogs, no blacks, no Irish" posters. What do you think?
Well,
go on.
I'm just trying to give an example of something other than the Holocaust.
Yeah.
To say that
I don't think you need to. Do you?
Jews have suffered racism throughout the ages.
Of course,
it's been called anti-Semitism, but it's no less racism.
No, I completely agree with you. I've just got the professional niggle in my mind that I don't want to spend an hour of everybody saying exactly the same thing, which is why I'm interested in the question of what she thought she was saying. Because I do actually believe her when she says, I wish to wholly and unreservedly withdraw my remarks and disassociate myself from them. I don't want to trivialise it, but if you've had a few beers and you send a tweet and then you wake up the next morning and read it and think to yourself, oh my days, what the heck happened there? I get how that can happen to people, but usually you can work out what they were trying to say. I don't know what she was trying to say, David.
No, well, to me, it just smacks of anti-Semitism. Full stop.
Your experience is not as bad as mine, is what she's saying, really.
Yes, of course it is.
I can't see how anyone. I genuinely can't see how anyone could argue with that. The analysis of what it is that she's trying to say. Don't come with me, your anti-Semitism. You don't know what real racism is like. Crikey. And B, how was this allowed to see the light of day? I don't think that the Fleet Street Kremlinology is as interesting to anybody else as it is to former residents of Fleet Street. But I presume the Observer is so cut to the bone now in terms of. I presume that someone was on holiday and someone was standing in as the letters editor who was not far up from work experience, because how that A got printed and B didn't get picked up by the rest of them. It was a front page story, this. It's a front page story today in all the other newspapers. And the Observer had it tucked away on the letters page. But that, as I say, is just me being a bit anarchy. David, thank you. Sam's in Muswell Hill. Sam, what made you pick up the phone?
James, yeah, absolutely seething about what happened yesterday. Before I get to my point, this morning I dropped my kids at school and nursery.
Yeah.
Said good morning to the security guards standing there. Those security guards are paid for by the government, which I'm very grateful for. And the reason that we have security guards in Jewish schools in Britain in 2023 is because there is a threat to those kids in those schools. And there are bomb alerts that go off in those schools specifically to protect those kids against people coming into the school trying to hurt them.
Yes.
And that, you can argue that probably won't happen.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
But it doesn't matter because
you've still got to explain to your children why the security guards are there at some point.
Of course. And the trauma from the Holocaust, is felt through families and association with families that went through that. And then people like me in professional life, we've suffered from anti-Jewish type remarks, and we can go into the whole Badil arguments of Jews don't count and why this racism is so insidious, because there's a view that Jews are white, Jews have privilege, forgetting Israel completely. It's not possible for rich white Jews to have racism happen against them because
they're rich and white
to start with. Exactly, and that's terrible. The other thing I wanted to say
she brought Irish and travellers into it as well, which for me makes it even harder to comprehend.
Yes, and we've seen this from, there was a Whoopi Goldberg, also got suspended from The View in 2022, when she made a similar comment to say that race wasn't an issue in the Holocaust. And I'm trying to see the point of view here, and I understand, I don't understand, but I try to empathise as much as I can with people of colour and the pain that they suffer from the racism directed against them, which is obviously largely linked to the colour of their skin. And what I would ask Diane Abbott to do, if I were talking to her now, is please, let's all be allies together. Please don't just apologise and do what everyone else does and choose your words carefully and try and save your political career. Please go to the Holocaust Museum. Please try and understand the nuances and the differences between the racism that people of colour have suffered and the racism that other types of people have suffered. And then let's build a stronger alliance so that she can be welcomed back and she can be an educated part of the conversation, because many, many, many people feel this way. And that's what I would really like to see. I think Diane Abbott
Can you put, when you say they feel this way, can you put in a sentence how they feel?
They feel that the race, that Jews can't, it's like puffery to say that Jews can suffer from racism because we're part of the establishment. And,
but then I keep referring back to the other people she included in it. Is it? I mean, if we focus on anti-Semitism, if you could read her mind, then would it be there is a consensus, albeit that this caucus of which you speak, where this opinion is held, has come to prominence in recent years under Jeremy Corbyn's stewardship. Most of us probably, even if we're traditionally very left-wing, most of us probably didn't know that really existed, that worldview, that outlook, until they kind of almost got their hands, well, they did get their hands on the steering wheel, so to speak. But is it there is a general consensus on, for example, the Holocaust being a Holocaust, it being one of the foulest scars on the history of humanity, and yet we do still live in a country where senior politicians, usually from the Conservative Party, can talk about the lived experience. They can deny the lived experience. I mean, you had the Chief Constable of Manchester on LBC last week rejecting the use of the phrase institutional racism to describe institutional racism. So wrongly, people like Diane Abbott see an injustice in focus on these issues. And how you leap from that to, well, the one doesn't matter. What she's really saying is this should matter as much as, but she ends up saying the thing it should matter as much as doesn't matter as much.
Yeah. Everyone's completely entitled to prioritise and focus on the causes that they care about the most. Yes. And I wouldn't expect anything less. But as a politician and a senior politician, you have to have that ability to spend more time than you otherwise would focusing on other types of similar issues so that you can build credibility. And when you find yourself in the unfortunate situation of being a hypocrite, which is that you have a reputation for a particular thing, like, social injustice, the first black female MP, I believe, you have a responsibility to be a thought leader in the wider area. And that's why it's so hurtful that the apology has focused on, these really sort of pathetic points about process. When actually,
half of the apology did, Sam. To be fair, the second half says racism takes many forms and it is completely undeniable that Jewish people have suffered from its monstrous effects, as have Irish people, travellers and many others. So the excuse is focusing on process. The apology is full-throated, but of course, and then she goes on, once again, I would like to apologise publicly for the remarks and any distress caused as a result of them. I mean, it's an unequivocal apology, but one wonders whether the offence is too great for the apology even to matter. And that, of course, is why you have an inquiry. That's why you have an investigation. Quite a few people pointing out, as Sam well knows, and it was just the point that he was making, didn't admit this. Look, there's plenty of Jews who aren't white, but in the context of anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom, it is largely going to be directed at people perceived as being white and rich. I always remember a call, I'll tell you because I'm very late for the news, I'll tell you after that, the very latest headlines with Thomas Watts. 10:38 is the time, looking at the situation in Sudan and utterly predictable attempts to blame. They're trying to blame. I mean, it's going to be the boogie by tea time, isn't it? Can anyone do it off the top of their head? Things that the people responsible for what is happening in this country that are blamed by the people responsible for what is happening in this country. The things that the people respond. So you start at the IMF, apparently, the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, the OECD, the Bank of England, the what else have we got? The new liberal elite. That was fun, wasn't it, while it lasted? Who else is on that list? I know there are individuals like Gary Lineker and Carol Vorderman. But now, today, I mean, it's got to be a longer list than that. We've got to be able to get a little bit further down the line before we reach... It's now the civil services' fault that this government can't punch its way out of a wet paper bag. If you really wanted British people in a war zone, in a country that descends into war at breakneck speed, to be properly looked after, I would cautiously suggest that making James Cleverly Foreign Secretary was probably not... I mean, making Dominic Raab Foreign Secretary or James Cleverly Foreign Secretary was probably not the best move. I think, for what it's worth, that James Cleverly is a nice bloke, actually. I've made the mistake of meeting him. I never like to meet politicians because it robs me of my ability to be as rude as I like to be subsequently. And also, he came out against some of Suella Braverman's disgusting refugee policies last week, which takes some courage in the current context. But competence and niceness are not even cousins, are they? And the idea that you can pick politicians from the talent puddle that Rishi Sunak is reduced to as a consequence of only being able to pick people that essentially supported Brexit or who have abandoned their evidence-based objections to it, like Jeremy Hunt or even Liz Truss, it really limits the field. And Rory Stewart could have been Foreign Secretary by now, you know, in a different world, in a different universe where no one had ever let people like Nigel Farage into places where respectable people gather. Incredible to reflect upon it. But anyway, I just mentioned that because we will talk, hopefully, about what it's actually like to work in a ministry. But I know there are loads of restrictions and regulations regarding what you can and can't say. So it may not work as a topic. I'm just giving you early warning that I'm going to try to find out what the job actually involves if you're a civil servant who works in a ministry. Michael can steer us back to the conversation about Diane Abbott. It's a curious mixture of horror, disgust and befuddlement, to be honest with you, at what the hell happened. Michael, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello.
My name is Michael Cohen. I've lived in Stamford Hill for the last 12 years. And for us, it hasn't come as any surprise whatsoever.
Go on.
We've got records here in the community over 24 times in the last 5 years where we've asked Diana for her help for needs for the Jewish community.
Wait, you've asked who for what? Sorry.
The community.
Yes.
We've got the biggest community here in Europe, Orthodox Jewish community. We've got close to 6,000 families.
But who have you
Stamford
asked?
Hill.
Who have you asked for help?
And the community have approached Diane Abbott over the years.
No, Diane Abbott. Sorry, I just misheard you.
Diane
I see.
Abbott,
Yes.
over the years, numerous times for help for the needs of the community here in Stamford Hill, where she is our MP.
Yes.
She has never, ever, ever helped the community. She is the first to bash Israel at every occasion. Now, she's got her rights to have her views, like everyone has a right.
What sort of help have you asked her for, if you don't mind me asking?
For example, we need help planning issues, to meet the needs of the community. We need help with stuff going on in the area, like parking, street issues. She has never, ever stood up for the needs of the community.
And
She's got the biggest, largest
what needs?
Jewish community.
No, I know. I understand that. You've told me a couple of times. What are the parking needs unique to your community?
I'll give you a small example of what's been going on the last year. We've got one of the worst circumstances of LTN. If you come down to Stamford Hill, any time of the day, the traffic here is horrendous. They've killed away the area.
Forgive me. How is that relevant to your race or religion?
So I'll tell you. If an MP of the biggest community has never, ever tried to help the community, she's the first to bash Israel.
There'll be loads of other people in her constituency who have really, really hacked off about LTNs as well. I don't think... I mean, there is evidence here of anti-Semitism in the letter that she wrote to the Observer, but I need a little bit of help understanding...
I'm not saying by not helping it's anti-Semitism.
But there'll be loads of people in the community who are hacked off with LTNs. It's such a hackneyed subject, if you pardon the pun.
It shows her true colours. She's the first to bash Israel at every occasion.
No, you keep repeating yourself, but
she's never condemned Jeremy Corbyn. She was one of her closest allies. That shows what she really stands for, her true colours. So it's come as no surprise to us, this letter yesterday. We've known it for very long. She's never tried to help us. She should be. She's never tried to
Are you aware of any parking, planning or LTN issues raised by people from different communities that she has taken up enthusiastically?
No. But I know that there are communities in Hackney where she has helped numerous times. For example, I'll give you another small example.
Yeah.
We've got very close ties with the Muslim community, and they've got the same complaint against her. So there are communities in Hackney where she helps, but there are communities which she has large members, huge Muslim communities, and she's never, ever helped them as well.
With the kind of issues
whatever's ever requested. I don't know what it is. But
well, you must know what it is to state so boldly that she hasn't addressed the issue. You must know what the issue is.
We've got monthly meetings between the Jewish and the Muslim communities here, and they keep raising the same concerns about Diane Abbott. That we've got an MP in our community.
Doesn't everybody do that, though, Michael? Doesn't everybody moan that their MP isn't doing enough for them?
No. It might be private people, but not full-grown communities. We're speaking here. The Jewish and Muslim communities together are close to 9,000 families.
Yes.
In Stamford Hill alone. And that shows something.
Well, it does. I'm not sure what, though. I mean, except that you wish that she'd been more supportive with your planning and parking and LTN issues.
No. You're getting me the wrong end of
well,
the
I'm only
stick.
working with the examples you're offering to
helping.
me.
It shows anti-Semitism.
No.
I'm showing.
What does it show?
Colours.
Well, that's why I asked if you're aware of her helping other people with the issues you've raised.
Definitely.
And you're not.
We know lots of instances.
So are the LTNs only in Stamford Hill?
Correct.
Right. There aren't any others in Hackney.
No, forget about LTN. I've mentioned
LTN. Well, you keep telling me things, and I keep asking about them, and you keep telling me to forget about them.
There are issues where she's more warm, she's more supportive.
Well, that's what I want. I'm looking for some examples.
I don't know.
Okay, well, when you do, we could probably explore the territory a little more fruitfully. But I just, you know how this programme works, I hope. But I'm always keen when accusations are levelled to have the evidence. And oddly, and respectfully, I don't know why you need to start talking about parking and LTNs when the words that she wrote in a letter to the Observer, which is, after all, what we're talking about today, are so absolutely illustrative of deep ignorance and prejudice and arguably anti-Semitism. And I put the word arguably in brackets, to be honest with you, because to tell Jewish people that they haven't suffered racism and have suffered instead prejudice akin to what redheads suffer, I almost think that you're undermining the attacks upon her, the criticisms of her, by bringing low traffic networks into it. I apologise if I've misunderstood you, though, Michael. 10:46 is the time. It is 10 minutes to 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the frankly stunning words of Diane Abbott continue to concern us. Just brief diversion. James, I don't live in London. What is an LTN? Can you tell me, please? It's a low traffic neighbourhood. So they've introduced all sorts of sort of plant pots and speed bumps and closed off roads, and the idea is that it will make short car journeys considerably less convenient than they previously were. Therefore, we will find other ways of going to the local shop or doing the school run or things like that. And a lot of people are very angry that short car journeys have become considerably less convenient as a consequence of these measures brought in to make short car journeys considerably less convenient. I simplify slightly, but that is one of the reasons why I generally don't do motoring-related issues on this programme. They bore me stupid. Rosie's in Harrow. Rosie, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi. So I'm Jewish, and my boyfriend is Nigerian. So I feel like I'm in a fairly unique position, and I am absolutely horrified at Diane Abbott's comments. I think it's really great that Keir Starmer took such a swift and decisive action to suspend her and really take a stand on it. But just on your question earlier, I've really been trying to understand what she was trying to say. And the only thing that I can possibly think of is that she was trying to say that with ethnic minorities, they can't hide their identity, they can't hide their race, whereas Jewish and Irish people, they kind of, they do blend in more.
Yes.
People would look at me and never know that I was Jewish. I'm blonde and blue-eyed. They'd have no idea.
Yeah, that's very generous of you, actually, and it is pretty much the only analysis that makes any sort of sense, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I still think it was absolutely awful that she even put it down in text.
Yes, of course.
And I think it was worded awfully, but I think that's the only justification I can think of in what she was trying to explain. And I do understand, obviously, from my boyfriend's point of view, he can't hide the fact that he's black.
He's not Jewish, is he? Just to be clear.
No, he's not.
Because, of course, he could be.
Yeah, he could be, but maybe one day, but not,
yes.
not right now. So I'm not exposed to. I hear people be anti-Semitic, kind of, not massively,
sure,
but around me, and not know that I'm there.
So she could have talked about a very particular type of racism that is only going to be triggered by immediately visible traits. And yes, she could then point out that for Irish people or for most Jewish people or for travellers, that is not going to happen because you're not possessed of the traits. Yeah. But she didn't. She said that's not racism, and that is why she's in so much trouble, isn't it? Quite rightly.
And also she's talking about ginger people. Well, you can see that they're ginger, and you can't see that someone's ginger. It's different.
No,
anyway.
You're absolutely right, because that undermines even the point that you're very generously suggesting she might have been trying to make, because here's someone who has got a physical characteristic that might invite abuse, but to suggest that that's akin to the kind of abuse that Jewish people have historically received is it's just out to lunch, isn't it?
It's just trying to say, well, our racism is worse than yours and stuff like that. And actually, if anyone feels like they're being offended or racist, and that's their decision. That's on them if they feel like that. So
anyway, can you see any kind of role for her now? I mean, in the party.
I think what your earlier caller was saying about if she, went away and educated herself properly and came back with this newfound opinion, but I feel like it's quite ingrained in her.
I thought that was I thought that was very generous of Sam as well, given what's happened in the last few years, particularly with regard to Diane Abbott's wing of the Labour Party and anti-Semitism, that the idea that she is capable now of learning the sort of lessons that Sam was talking about, I thought was, should we just say, a little optimistic.
Yeah, I think it probably is time for her to go.
On Sam's part. And it's such a, you cannot alter the work that she's done in adjacent fields, incredibly powerful work, and you cannot deny the appalling abuses that she's received, often very, very racist abuses, but none of that provides cover for this sort of conduct. Rosie, thank you. This is nicely put on a similar theme, actually, from Gareth in Pontypridd. Abbott has disappointed me greatly. Her words are indefensible, but the irony of all the country's leading white reactionaries luxuriating in getting to call a black woman, and perhaps one of the most abused black women in our society currently, a racist, and getting to ignore Labour's hierarchy of racism is not lost on me. I'd love to call in on this to recommend some great black perspectives, but frankly, you should probably get input from black and brown listeners instead of yet another woke but probably clueless white person. Says Gareth, describing both of us, I think, fairly neatly as woke but probably clueless white people. Well, okay. I mean, I understand what she is trying to say. That's fine. But under her own analysis and in the context of her own apology, what she has said is objectively appalling. And I think it probably should be, or certainly could be, career-ending. I don't know whether, I presume she was planning to fight the next election as the Labour member for Hackney, but can she? Donna's in Lambeth. Donna, what would you like to say?
Yes, hello.
Hi, Donna.
I kind of understand what Diane is trying to say, similar to what your last caller just outlined it perfectly.
Yes.
Where she was saying, as a black person myself, as a British black person, I kind of sometimes think that our experience that we go through on a daily basis in terms of racism is kind of ignored, where it's not taken as seriously as say when you talk about anti-Semitic with the Jews. It's not taken as seriously. If you can have a Home Secretary that can spew out hatred and racism towards people of colour.
And also you have a government at the moment that is engaged in fairly widespread attempts to deny the reality of what you describe. You've got reports denying systemic racism. You've got Louise Casey describing institutional racism in the Met, and then the Chief Constable denying that it exists. So, but yeah, I mean, that is...
Exactly, but that's what she was trying to say.
Wow,
the way she worded it was completely wrong. You must understand that Diane Abbott has been on the forefront of equality and equal opportunity. And then also, you have to look at Keir Starmer. His political stance on this is you have to think, because she was a fan of Corbyn, because she was a friend of Corbyn, you can't have no Corbyn association or affiliation in the Labour Party.
Well, that may be true, but I'm afraid you can't fault the way that he's handled this issue, Donna, because he has a big oil tanker to turn around with Jewish voters in this country and with people who aren't Jewish, but who were... Yes,
he has. I understand that, but also my argument would be I have voted Labour, in the past, but I will not be voting Labour now, because my argument is that he concentrates on just one particular group of people all the time. What about the Muslims? Yeah, what about their hate? What about their attacks? Every single thing with
I'm going to argue with you now. I don't think that's true.
On anti-Semitic, it is.
Well, but the Labour Party hasn't spent a period of years offering what appeared to be shelter and support for people who were anti-Semitic. So it's at the top of Keir Starmer's to-do list because the party was found by numerous inquiries to have been embarked upon a really ugly path. He has to get them off that path. No one's ever accused the Labour Party of harbouring other types of racism. He doesn't. It's not on his to-do list, Donna. You must understand that.
I understand.
So who are you going to vote for
what they're talking.
in a general election?
I'm not going to vote for anyone. They're all muppets. But the biggest muppet of all now is the Labour Party.
Okay, and that's after Diane Abbott's intervention this weekend was so roundly and swiftly dealt with by the leadership.
Listen,
I am.
The way how Keir Starmer has behaved throughout from his taking, the leadership is questionable for me.
Okay.
It's nothing to do with the anti-Semitic as a whole. It's just the way how he's trying to be a people pleaser. He sits on the fence.
Yeah.
You can never get
these are valid criticisms
from him.
Yeah.
I can't give my vote to
someone He does give straight answers, but he's nowhere near as robust in many, many areas as you might like to, as we would both like to see. And whether or not this is a calculation that proves correct electorally, only time will tell. But right now, I mean, off the top of either of our heads, we could come up with half a dozen things where you'd like to see a much stronger line being taken by the leader of the opposition.
I would. But,
me too.
But for Diane Abbott, fault, the way how she worded the letter was totally unacceptable. That I agree with, because you must understand that when my parents came here, they couldn't get a boarding house, and they actually boarded with Irish.
Yeah.
So every you go back to the 50s or the 60s, everybody in their family has an Auntie Anne or an Auntie Maureen, because that's where you had the interrelationship.
Yeah.
Because they were the ones that all board together. In that concept, I think she got that wrong.
She did, and an hour of talking about it hasn't brought me much closer to understanding how she could have got it so wrong. But I think you and the woman before probably coming close, was it Rosie, I think, coming closest to a generous reading, Rosie being Jewish, you, Donna, I think being black, when you mentioned your mum and dad coming over here. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so two women, one Jewish, one black, both sort of offering up a charitable analysis of what she probably meant, but equally both acknowledging absolutely clearly that the phraseology, the mode of expression, the language used, the points made are off the charts awful, absolutely awful. It's 11:01. As I suggested at 10 o'clock this morning, no shortage of people wanting to talk about this. Thank you to everybody who did ring in for actually being thoughtful and thought-provoking, because I don't think there's much fun in everybody just sort of queuing up to lob rotten tomatoes at anybody. But on this occasion, we're probably closer to that territory than usual. 11:02. Should we carry on talking about it? I'll let you decide. It's 11:02. 11:06 is the time. Okay, I've jotted down a short list. I wonder if you can add to it. Feel free to do so if you can. So you've got the IMF, the OBR, the OECD, the Bank of England, the ECHR, the EU, the House of Lords, universities, the judiciary, the legal profession in general. That's 10. I've done it, and we haven't even reached the civil service yet. So these are institutions, not even individuals, which the people that brought you Brexit, Boris Johnson, economic decline, international humiliation. I don't know if you've seen the German article in Der Spiegel about the state of this nation that was published over the weekend. I tell you now, if you're on a gammon-only diet, do not go near it. Seriously, it will cause you all manner of digestive problems. But that's 10 institutions right there that are under attack from the people desperately trying to evade responsibility for what they have done. And I told you so is a fairly lazy refrain, but lots of people did, of course, tell you that this would happen. That when the reality of this political path became clear, the people who had set us upon it would be determined to blame anybody else. I didn't even put Remainers on that list either. The idea that somehow, if only people who understand things had been quieter, then the people who don't understand anything would have been more successful in their mission to deliver unicorns to every house in the country. So you've got the IMF, the OBR, the OECD, the Bank of England, the ECHR, the EU, the House of Lords, universities, the judiciary, and the legal profession, and not just the judges, but also, of course, the lawyers, and then Remainers as well. I presume that if you've got gristle for brains, you would describe all 10 of those organisations as Remainers anyway, so maybe it's tautological. And then we have the new one, the civil service, the blob, which is now in the firing line, quite incredibly, partly because Dominic Raab bullied people, as of course did Priti Patel, although Priti Patel hadn't promised to resign in the event of being found to be a bully. It is remarkable how Diane Abbott has, I think, rightly drawn more attention over the last couple of days than Dominic Raab has. But again, from a political point of view, what a liability that makes her when the Labour Party should be really making hay with Dominic Raab's disgrace. They are instead fighting the fire thrown up by Diane Abbott's disgrace, a woman who's not even close to the shadow front bench. And yet, of course, here we are, all talking about her all over the front pages, and Dominic Raab has got a free pass, despite many people, including, I think there's a Liberal Democrat campaign, contending he's not really got any business being an MP, never mind just losing his role as Deputy Prime Minister. Also worth drawing the contrast between how Starmer deals with trouble in the ranks and how Sunak does. But it's the civil service. So I think that people like Rees-Mogg had already started, hadn't they, with his insistence that everybody comes into work, and the imputation that civil servants who were working from home were somehow not working at all or being lazy. That was, in classic Rees-Mogg fashion, it turned out that if everybody did come back to the office, there wouldn't be enough desks to go round because the world has turned. And Rees-Mogg, of course, the member for the late 18th century. So you have that attempt. Just watch them closely. This is important, all right? I think I've earned the right to claim a degree of prescience when it comes to how this lot operate, haven't I? I mean, in terms of telling you what's going to happen next. If you could have put money on it over the last 6 or 7 years, I would have made you a fortune. So just watch closely. And Rees-Mogg is often an outlier on this. Rees-Mogg and David Frost. The desperate attempt to claim that they are being held back or sabotaged or scuppered. It's a form of the betrayal narrative. The idea that if only it wasn't for you pesky kids, I could have got away with it. It's pathetic, and it's dangerous, and it's essentially ignorant. It's so ignorant. It has to be ignorant. It relies upon people not only not understanding things, but also on them not wanting to understand things. So the invitation to hate the European Union without any real basis for doing so, of course, proved incredibly intoxicating. And now the same people are inviting you to hate the civil service. Think about that for a moment. At what point do you think the people who are constantly telling you who to hate, the IMF, the OBR, the OECD, the Bank of England, the ECHR, the EU, the House of Lords, universities, the judiciary, the legal profession, Remainers, the civil service, they call it the blob. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah, very clever. Very astute analysis. They call it. At which point do you think the people who are always telling you what to hate are going to be held responsible for what they have done? The IMF is a particularly funny example. If we ended up in the kind of mess that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were leading us towards, guess who bails us out? The IMF bail us out. But they're somehow the enemy of the United Kingdom, deliberately trying to damage us and weaken our standing on the world stage. It doesn't make any sense. But that's the point I mean. That's the point I make when I talk about how ignorance is essential to this sort of project. It's not just about people who don't understand things. It relies upon people who don't want to understand things. So when they invite you to hate the civil service, they are once again inviting you to blame their own uselessness on anybody else at all. Anybody else at all. What have you got? Who are you going to blame? What have you got? That list, I'm going to probably commit it to memory. I think it might become one of those things that I intone on a relatively regular basis on the programme. The IMF, the OBR, we need to do it like that They Might Be Giants song. Constantinople, Istanbul, Constantinople. We need to do the IMF, OBR, OECD, Bank of England, Civil Service, the ECR, the EU. I'll probably come up with a slightly better tune if I do try to commit it to memory. So what I would like to do now is talk about the reality of working in the civil service, ideally in a ministry. But I'm not allowed to... I know that you're not allowed to say that much. So it's 12 minutes after 11. I may change course at past. Odd J says we should have done another hour on Abbott. Everyone's a critic these days. Well, listen, I can guarantee that colleagues will be returning to that territory later in the day, and there's nothing to stop me returning to it later in the week, or indeed later in the programme. But the notion of the civil servant, so I like this idea that Dominic Raab had to be a bully because that's how you get things done. And yet none of his predecessors in the Foreign Office have been accused of bullying. It's odd that. Priti Patel was Home Secretary when she was found guilty of bullying. So it's a bit early, I think, and Abbott has overshadowed it, to have a conversation about bullies who don't realise they're bullies. That was my original plan. when I went home on Friday. I thought, we'll get stuck into that on Monday. But I think this is quite important now. The job of a civil servant is to enact the will of their political masters, right? Now, that's a relatively straightforward thing to do. It sometimes involves telling them about the parameters of plausibility and reality. Well, we can't really do that. They are traditionally portrayed as being quite traditional, as in they're not huge fans of enormous change or revolutionary upheaval. Brexit, of course, being a relatively revolutionary upheaval, albeit that pretty much everybody now agrees it was a stupid thing to do, with the exception, of course, of the people still in charge of the country who are trying to blame everybody but themselves for what's happening to the country. So there'll have to be I'm talking about ministries. I'm not talking about the Border Force or the HMRC. I'm talking about people who work in Whitehall, effectively. Civil servants in Whitehall charged with dealing with and delivering the desires of elected politicians. Because in the most simplistic of terms, politicians blaming civil servants are workmen blaming tools. And I say simplistic because that may be open to some challenge or analysis. But the workmen blame, why can't you get this done? Why, for example, has the Foreign Office made such a mess of getting British citizens out of Sudan? Oh, well, don't blame the Foreign Secretary or the government or the Prime Minister. Blame the civil servants. But the civil servants' job is to do what their political masters tell them, or to try to do what their political masters tell them, or to tell their political masters why they can't do what their political masters tell them. It's not to sit there coming up with policies that they haven't been asked to come up with, as far as I know. Enemies of the people, of course, was our judiciary. I didn't know judiciary was on the list. You weren't paying attention to my... So the IMF, the OBR, the OECD, the Bank of England, the ECHR, the EU, the House of Lords, universities, the judiciary, the legal profession in general, and the civil service. That's 12 now. We're up to 12. I'd like to get it up to 20. And then I could do half a chapter on each, and that's my new book finished. 11:15 is the time. The question is this. What happens? What happens in ministries, in Whitehall? What does the civil service do? I'm not apologising for this question, by the way. You can sit there and say, oh, well, you should know that, but that means you can ring me up and tell me, because I don't know that. Not properly, not completely. I know, because I've watched it happen now for 7 years, that when an institution comes under attack from the most invidious and dishonest class and generation of politician this country has ever seen, then they are always lying. When they turn you against judges, they are lying. When they turn you against universities, they are lying. They are desperately seeking to misrepresent dissent, criticism. They're trying to outlaw criticism. There's a piece in the Times today by Edward Lucas about Jacob Rees-Mogg, essentially banning anybody who's ever criticised the government from coming in to talk to civil servants. That is Soviet-era Russia-style policy, but it is being waved through fairly comfortably in the current climate. So when an institution, in this case the civil service, comes under attack from people like Dominic Raab and Jacob Rees-Mogg and the rest of them, you can be certain of two things. The attack is undeserved and exculpatory. It's designed to let them off the hook for things that they're responsible for. And number two, it's deeply, deeply dishonest. So let's try and shine a little light into it. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Here's an example from Neil in Newport. I work in the Welsh Civil Service as a policy advisor to ministers. We enjoy a relationship based on mutual professional respect. We help deliver their aims, whatever they are. We do not instruct them on what they should be committed to. So as people like Dominic Raab and Jacob Rees-Mogg seek to lie about the civil service and civil servants in exactly the same way that they lied about the European Union and the European Commission, then what is the actual truth? And if you hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. I wonder whether retired people are going to be our best bet. Don't break the Official Secrets Act, please. But apart from that, hit the numbers now and you will get through. 20 minutes after 11, and it's about 52:48 at the moment that this one might work. There are two reasons, of course. Civil servants are not really permitted to say a great deal about what it is that they do. Will in Keston reminds us that, James, we're currently in a pre-election purdah, which means we have to be extra careful to conduct ourselves in accordance with the Civil Service Code re impartiality. Even more so than usual, we have to be careful about what we say publicly. And the second reason, of course, is that the sort of Mandarin of which I'm thinking is not necessarily super likely to ring a radio phone-in programme. I'm just thinking of what the scriptwriters of Yes Minister would have made of it if Sir Humphrey popped up on LBC talking to the 1970s equivalent of James O'Brien. It would have been Brian, wouldn't it? The great Brian Hayes. You did what? Well, I phoned up LBC Minister and told them what my job involves. You did what? But I'm nothing if not optimistic. So I'm holding out, and the phone lines are open. I'll be with B imminently. I'm just going to read a couple of texts on message. Please don't say my name. I worked in the National Audit Office for 13 years, which audited the civil service and operated similarly. The civil service can't do anything without it being checked, reviewed, checked again at every layer up to ministerial level. That's why things take so long, because there are so many layers of accountability. When I left, I found it odd to be able to just get stuff done. Another person requesting anonymity. We do analysis of policy options to see what is viable, the economic and legal arguments, etc., to see whether the policies stack up. If the minister's preferred option doesn't work, we find other solutions for them, which they are free to reject. We prepare draft notes, speeches, and prepare them for debates and meetings. We support them by giving them cleared policy and legal lines during debates. We find the answers they don't have. The list goes on and on and on, and that's fine. It would be nice, though, if this was appreciated rather than slated. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. B's in Exeter. B, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, you asked for retired members of the civil service to call in.
I did.
And as somebody who is a retired member of the civil service, I felt duty-bound.
Marvellous.
To pick up the phone.
Well, reading that message from Sarah, I think there is an element of duty kicking in, because the misrepresentation of what civil servants do is becoming fairly weapons grade, and yet the reality barely gets a look in. So thank goodness you're here. What can you tell us?
Well, I think the message you read out just now about the list of things that civil servants do is largely accurate. The whole point of the civil service is to find a way to implement what an elected government wants. Now, I think the problem that we have now is that the consequences of trying to implement what the elected government wants are so horrific for the country, and it is also part of the civil service's duty to point out what the risks and benefits of any given policy direction are, that they don't want to hear it. They don't want, it is our job, I say is.
Yes.
It was my job to point out the consequences, and also to point out, particularly with reference to foreign policy, with the Home Department, in some ways it's a little different, because they have the ability to legislate for stuff within the country. But when it comes to the Foreign Office, you can't tell nearly 200 other countries what it is they have to do. You have to persuade them. And you can only really persuade them to do things if it is in their benefit. And that is one of the reasons why we were the most effective country within the EU, because we were brilliant at delivering policy across the whole of the EU that benefited the whole of the EU and benefited the UK.
And had the UK's signature, had the UK's fingerprints all over it. It must have been very frustrating to see how at odds with what was reported back at home, the reality of what was happening in those sort of scenarios actually was.
Well, yes, I mean, I retired in 2016. I retired I retired about a month before. Can't remember the date of the referendum now. It's terrible,
June.
Isn't it?
June.
This is age for you. No, I retired just before the referendum, and I woke up sobbing when I heard the results, because I could see, I mean, if you are a person who's interested in strategy, my final 10 years in the Foreign Office were almost exclusively on international security policy.
Gosh.
And the EU, just the biggest peace project that we've ever been involved in. Brilliant for peace across the continent. And there we were talking about, I mean, back in 2016, one couldn't know how dreadfully the government would go about implementing what was, after all, an opinion poll.
Yes.
And whenever there was a bad step to take, they took it.
They took it.
It was absolutely astonishing. I remember thinking...
Well, it's not under your analysis. We're talking about ideology coming up against against reality, and the civil servant is caught in the crossfire. How can we be confident that, because these sort of opinions you wouldn't be able to express when you were still in the job publicly, how can I be confident, let alone somebody listening who is on the other side still of the Brexit debate, if such people exist, how can I be confident that this depth of feeling and conviction, however evidence-based it may be, wouldn't actually leach into your work with a minister or a Secretary of State like Dominic Raab, who, without a great deal of intellectual heft, it must be said, was under the impression that Brexit was both easy and desirable? I mean, how do you see what I mean? There is a bias.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, it is one's conviction can easily be laid aside. I was very often, goodness me, I joined the Foreign Office in, 1970, I can't even remember, 7,
Gosh.
I think it was. I think it was Callaghan Prime Minister when I joined. Goodness me. So, there have been...
That's a shift.
Yeah, I know. There have been governments of every political stripe while I was in the Foreign Office. I was out for a while as well. It wasn't an end-to-end career. But it didn't matter.
No.
If you're clever enough to be doing that sort of work...
Yes.
Then you are clever enough to put your own views aside and use reality as your guide. And that's what the civil service is there for. It's to point out, particularly in terms of work in the Foreign Office, when you are, or when your proposal, the government's proposal, is liable to break international law. And in my day, any sniff of being within a mile of causing somebody even to think that you might be scratching at the edges of doing something that was in contravention of international law would be kicked as far into touch as possible. It just was not acceptable. So, of course, you wrote in your submissions that, there were problems. There were liable to be problems ahead. Now, most of the time, in my time, I didn't have to worry about that so much because, if anything, because the governments that I worked under, none of them, and Thatcher in particular, would have had anything to do with looking at breaching international law. It was anathema.
Gosh. I mean, this is a remarkable...
And breaking UK law, the same.
No, of course. Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, and now they blithely announce in the House of Commons that they're intending to do it, albeit in a very limited and specific way. And of course, Braverman...
Does my head in. It is. I mean, and what that does to our reputation around the world, can you imagine? I mean, the one thing I have to say, and I think we can look at this with respect to the United States. Trump was in for 4 years. And everything the US did was widely and roundly, denigrated when he withdrew from this or argued against this. But you put somebody competent in power and see how quickly it can turn around. In a smaller, to use a smaller analogy, my last overseas posting was as Deputy Head of Mission to the UK delegation to the OSCE, which is an international organisation not everybody has necessarily heard of. But I dealt with all of the security issues. So, the Pol Mil issues, as they were called, the politico-military stuff. And while I was there, other Pol Mil reps would cycle through their period of posting. And you would get somebody from a country get posted in to be my opposite number in the Forum for Security Cooperation, which was like, that was the big meeting area that we worked in. And they were useless. It was astonishing how quickly those people would just be cut out of whatever was going on and informed about it later. And then somebody competent would come in, and all of a sudden they were right back in the circle. And you can see that happening with the US government, with Joe Biden. There was hardly a trip before Joe Biden's government welcomed back into the international fold as a respected representative of his nation. So there is room. If we get rid of this absolute shower and get somebody competent in charge, I actually almost don't care what colour they are.
Sure. Politically.
But,
or literally.
Well, no, I don't care. Literally
of course you don't.
Or figuratively. What colour
just
they
competence.
Are.
That sort of objective competence.
Competent and truthful.
Well, that you
and
lead
honest and following those the civil service guidelines, the ministerial guidelines. People who can follow those properly. That's what we need.
Well, you've injected some much-needed optimism into your analysis, because it was pretty bleak for a while there, B. And yet the relative ease with which a degree of normality could be restored is something that many people listening will find very comforting. How do you either make sense of or deal with the increasingly clamorous attempts to criticise the civil service in sort of just broad terms, talking about the blob, Jacob Rees-Mogg and others trying to create the impression that your former colleagues are deliberately trying to frustrate politics, that Brexit could have gone well if it wasn't for civil servants? I mean, you talked about the unprecedented nature of being so relaxed about breaking or ignoring international law. What about the actual maligning of the civil service? How dangerous is that?
It's hateful. And my method for dealing with it is to swear a lot.
Very healthy.
Very
not on the radio, please be.
Well, no. You'll notice I haven't indulged in that particular vibe.
No, you've been a paragon.
Thank you. I do my best. I do. I swear a lot.
Yes.
I scream at the telly. I find myself despondent, and then I think about the things that can change, and I knit.
You knit?
Yes.
Well, there's nothing quite like knitting. But it is. You are watching you're watching a skip fire, but
indeed,
with the knowledge that the fire will burn out at some point. It's just a question of how much damage it does before it does. And
that's the thing that worries me most, is how much damage will be done before it can be turned around. Because turned around it will be. I mean, the arc of history always bends towards justice, or there's some.
Yes.
There are many, many wonderful sayings about how we will get past this. But, you look how long it took Germany to get past the Second World War. And I'm not saying, we haven't got bombs flying over London or anything like that.
No, the damage is self-inflicted.
But the damage is huge.
Yes.
Because you have to turn the rump of the population around to understanding reality as well. And when our public services are across the board in such disarray, that takes time too. Without an educated population, how do you get people to understand the consequences of voting for a bunch of charlatans who are busy stuffing their pockets while emptying the treasury? How do you get people to understand that that's not acceptable and persuade them to go out and vote?
That's the question for the ages, really. And because, as you fully understand, the outlets which might help people arrive at these conclusions or come to these realisations are largely complicit in the original political plan. B, you've made me record-breakingly late for the news. I hope you'll take that as a compliment.
So
but allow me to read you what Stephen in Milton Keynes has to say about your contribution. He says, a caller is blooming good when James just shuts up.
Oh, sorry, but that also means I never do.
No, on the contrary, it means that every syllable was unmissable. Thank you for that. And I don't imagine it was easy for you, actually, because that's what patriotism sounds like, if anyone has mistaken it for the lazy xenophobia or the pub bore racism of some people in the public eye at the moment. That's what patriotism sounds like, a deep and abiding concern for the welfare, not of some mythical or a theoretical notion of nationhood, but for the people that live on a land. Thank you, B. It's 11:35. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 20 minutes to 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. An awful lot of admiration and praise coming in for B, the last caller. I will read some of it out, actually. You should offer Bea a weekly half-hour slot. She was fantastic, hit every single nail on the head. That's from Justin in Loughborough. Your last lady caller was so amazing. Applause for Bea. You should get the last caller to do your holiday cover, James, says Peter. I think she's brilliantly capable. I was hanging on Bea's every syllable. She has given me hope. Thank you, says Lorna in Cornwall. John in Newton-le-Willow said, delighted to hear the contribution from Bea. So informative and totally unbiased. And as you say, that is the mark of a true patriot. Thank you. And this one I'll read out as well, because it spreads the love towards me and my crack team of operatives. How brilliant was Bea, says Neil. And James, it's a huge credit to you and your team that you attract contributors of such expertise and clarity. You're right, but not many on a subject like this. I'm gonna, you can imagine the bar has now been set even higher than it was already. Sometimes I'll be with Richard imminently, but sometimes people ask me about, I talk to other radio people about the job and the phone in, and you've heard it all before, but they often haven't. And I say, if you get it right, you only need one brilliant caller and it justifies an entire topic. But it obviously, it's the opposite of getting 100 people queuing up to say things that aren't very interesting. But I do have plenty of room for more contributors on this, and I completely understand why it's a little bit harder than getting people to offer up their views on Diane Abbott. I want to know what the daily experience is like as well. Bea obviously rose quite high in the civil service. What in terms of job comparison, what does the job involve, and this idea that the civil service is somehow responsible for the fact that Dominic Raab couldn't get what he wanted to get done, or the fact that Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks the civil service is responsible for frustrating Brexit. It's absurd and it's obscene, but it strikes me that one of the best ways to prove that is to listen to people who've done the job and ask them what the job involves. Enter Richard in Exeter. Oh, hang on. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need if you think you can help the rest of us out. Richard, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hello. First time I've ever spoken to you, so...
welcome aboard.
Hello. Thank you. I was a civil servant for 33 and a third years, a third of a century.
Gosh.
And I sort of climbed ground. I was sitting in a Mandarin.
Yes.
I sort of ground slowly further upwards and had some dealings with ministers, not a huge amount.
Okay.
I have to say, when Hilary Benn was minister, I think everybody really respected him because he respected what people thought. It was a whole different approach and a really constructive,
yes,
helpful, sort of respectful approach on both sides. And then we had various other ministers obviously come in of a different hue, and there was a whole difference in attitude. And we had a lady who ended up being Prime Minister for a very short period of time, and she was our minister. And I was in charge of estates at the time, accommodation.
Right.
And we had been on a programme for several years of cutting costs by cutting out office space. So the idea of hot desking probably goes back to 2010, perhaps even before that.
Is that right? Long before the pandemic?
Way before the pandemic.
Which is probably why when Rees-Mogg started demanding that everybody returns to work, he discovered that if they did, they'd be sitting on the stairs and falling out of windows because there were way more desks than there were way more civil servants than there were desks.
Absolutely. And so when Liz Truss came into our department, I mentioned her name. One of her
I don't think you narrowed it down. We've only had 3 female prime ministers, and one of them hung around for ages. One of them had a fair crack of the whip, and one of them lasted 10 minutes. So no prizes for working out who Richard was talking about.
And she put a proposal, which eventually sort of wound its way down to me.
Right.
And the idea was that we should give up more of our desk space for agricultural businesses and farmers. So when they're popping into London,
right,
they can sort of pop into the office, do a bit of hot desking themselves, and then go home. And again, my thought was, well, hang on, we haven't got enough space for our own staff. We're going to be making more people homeless or hot desking.
And this came all the way from the Secretary of State.
Absolutely.
Freeing sort of free office space for farmers in the middle of Whitehall.
Exactly. Yeah.
What's that got to do with the Foreign Office?
No, I'm not Foreign Office.
Oh, this was in one of her previous incarnations.
Yeah, sorry.
No, my bad. So, okay. So as a farmer in London, coming up to see a show, And they might need to do a little bit of work of an afternoon. So can we make sure they've got some desks to sit at while you're
an agricultural contractor, I suppose. But
and you've been charged for years. You've been charged for years with finding ways of reducing the amount of desk space so that you can save money on office overhead.
Yeah. So obviously, what you do is you go back to the guy above you, and luckily I knew him from previous times. I did. This is just mad.
Yes.
It's just not going to work. It goes against every cabinet office principle.
Yes.
Who set this sort of general overall view on these things? And like, Richard, I know what you're saying is mad. I agree with you, but we've still got to present it as a viable option.
Right.
And we present the pros, we present the cons, and then it's for ministers to decide. It's not for us as civil servants to decide, it's for ministers to decide, but we need to make sure we put everything on the table so she can come to a valid decision. And that's how it is for everything. I mean, this is a small example, but that's how it is.
No, it's a wonderful example. So you put in front of her the history of Cabinet Office-inspired cuts to office space. You put in front of her the current ratio of staff to desks and the rotations involved in that. And then you say, and of course, and then she can look at it. You're essentially saying, look, here's 2 and here's 2, and you're inviting her to add it up, presuming that she'll come up with 4. In
the hope that she will, but if she comes up with 5, then the answer is we've still got to do it, guys.
And that is possibly where a lot of the recent rhetoric comes from. The idea of you're being frustrated. Why can't you make desk space appear is a sort of pedestrian equivalent of why can't you come up with some Brexit benefits? And the answer in both cases is because it is physically impossible. I can't make things that don't exist suddenly exist.
Another idea was that there was a bit of as you probably might remember, there's a bit of an issue in terms of bee numbers. And again, being the sort of Minister of DEFRA, the idea was, why don't we put some beehives on the top of our Millbank building?
Oh, Lord. Oh, this is thick of it, isn't it?
This is mad.
Yeah.
This is mad because bees, I don't know, it's about sort of 20 stories up.
Well, it might not
fly up that high.
I don't know, and it's not. I think they probably would actually, but in the context of making a meaningful difference to the national population of bees, I don't think a few hives on the roof. But you can see how that happened. You've got some ex-think tank person coming in as a special advisor. They're desperately trying to get into tomorrow's newspapers. They haven't got any substantive policy announcements to make, but they might get a nice little picture story on page 3 of the Times of Liz Truss dressed up like a beekeeper.
Yeah, and you've got civil servants, trying to do a job and then having to mess around, trying to source beehives or trying to work out.
It is thick of it territory. It's pure Armando Iannucci. Finally, I'll ask you this because I did ask B. I mean, we're chuckling, albeit with a bubbling subtext of relatively sinister goings on. These attacks, because they're going to grow. I've noticed them reaching into the media now. Attacks on the blob, attacks on the civil service. They've had 13 years in power. They've won 2 referendums, 3 or 4 general elections. They've had 4 or 5 different prime ministers. Things couldn't have gone better for them. They've got the full support of pretty much all of the influential print media. They've got backers and donors setting up television stations so that there's even less opportunity for people to offer up dissent. They've got every single card is in their hand, and now they're trying to attack the civil service because things are going so badly. How does that make you feel?
Well, luckily I'm not one anymore, but it does make me absolutely furious, quite honestly.
Yes.
It really does. I mean, nothing. No organisation's perfect, and of course, they're good and bad in every organisation. But as a general thing, as I say, civil service aren't there to be politicised. We're just there to do a job.
And even if you don't like the idea, you're judged, and your promotion depends on how good a job you do in implementing that idea, or that's the point, isn't it? So this narrative of you all being trying to scupper, that would involve a form of career suicide. It would be the surest way to ensure that you didn't make your way up the greasy pole yourself. And we've all watched Yes Minister and indeed Yes Prime Minister, and we're all familiar with the frustrations and the obfuscations. But the bottom line is that these Brexity geezers like Rees-Mogg and Raab somehow think that because you can't produce rabbits out of hats, you're deliberately and ideologically biased against them, because their entire political project hinges on promises that there'll be loads and loads of rabbits and loads of hats. And there aren't any. And that's when you get bullied, I imagine. What do you mean there aren't any? You're useless. I'll throw a tomato at you. Actually, I think he was cleared of throwing tomatoes. I'm not sure. But that's when it happens. You can see how it happens. It's when the vein in the side of his head starts throbbing. When people tell Raab that there are no unicorns, there are no rabbits. He said, but I've got a hat. I said, yeah, but I can't pull a rabbit out of it. Can you? It's not my job. You're the blob. All right, phone the Daily Mail. Get them to attack civil servants. There it is. Thank you, Richard. I sense you're enjoying your retirement. It is 11:54. This picks up nicely from Richard's call, because in a Birmingham civil service office after 2010, a restack was undertaken which crammed 3 floors into one to save money. Richard was probably in charge of that, mate, actually. Even if only 1/3 of staff came in, it was a crowded, stinking mess, and this was before COVID. The same with ministers championing the movement of offices from London to save money, and then the minister changes and the new one wants to know why his staff are so far away. Steve writes, I'm not a civil servant, but I worked on a government project recently alongside lots of civil servants. I remember one day when the minister completely changed direction 3 times. That's 3 times in one day, and everyone on the project had to start from scratch. I also remember when the minister made a mistake in Parliament, I believe genuinely, just not across the detail properly, and a week was spent figuring out what cover they needed so that they wouldn't have to go and correct the record. So this is something you should be concerned about. Attacks upon the civil service from precisely the same people who are either responsible for much of the mess that the country is in, or people in my profession, the media, who encouraged you to believe the people who are responsible for much of the mess that the country is in. And that is a perforated line. I think that plenty of people in the media get fired under con men rather than conned. Natalie is in Acton. Natalie, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
A little bit nervous. It's my first time calling, and also it's my friend who works in the civil service, and I want to keep her anonymity,
of
really.
Of course. No, absolutely. I will not ask you any leading questions, Natalie, I promise.
Perfect. Thank you. So she works in a particular ministry. She's been in the civil service for nearly 20 years, and just listening to some of the stories that she's come out with, sometimes it's beggars belief what the things that she has to do. I mean, an example was that they had to take out split infinitives out of ministers' briefings because that particular minister didn't particularly like having split infinitives. So someone in their team was dedicated to reading all of their documentation to take them out. So, all this hurrah about the Oxford comma before is nothing in comparison. Wow. She also told me that she had worked on a project for Dominic Raab, and she had to give him a briefing, and she has experienced some of his sort of bullying behaviour as well. And she found it shocking at the time, sort of like being the target in so many words.
Well, we know that he believes bullying is okay because he talks about how he can't believe how low the threshold is without being bright enough to realise that in his own resignation letter he was essentially offering up a defence of bullying.
Exactly. And I mean, she's born to be in the civil service. She's very impartial. She's very calm. She always looks at both sides, etc. So she managed to hold her ground. But it was after the meeting, someone in his team contacted her and said, well done for not crying in front of him.
Wow.
And, are you okay? And she sort of like replied back and said, yeah, I'm fine. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Considering that you've had to do all of this on a day-to-day basis. So it just kind of goes to show.
Well, I think there's a clash, isn't there, between, I mean, obviously as B put it best, when ideology comes face to face with reality, there can only be one winner, but people like Rob are incapable of either understanding that, let alone acknowledging it. So you're going to just have an increased vein throbbing moment, and the blame will be put upon the people who aren't pulling rabbits out of hats. I'm pleased with that analogy. We'll let that one stand. But I think there's possibly projection here as well, in that because you've got people who will say and do anything in order to protect their own position, up to and including breaking international law. Perhaps they think that everybody else is just as bankrupt morally, and therefore people like your friend must be deliberately lying or deliberately trying to frustrate progress. It's sort of, because if you can't acknowledge reality, you have to deny it, and therefore the person bringing you reality becomes the enemy, not the friend, which is the role of the civil servant, of course, in a normal government.
Exactly. And just like to point out with B, she was just an absolute star.
Wasn't she?
If you've got the right person,
yes.
They'll work hard, and that's the whole point, is to like facilitate whatever the minister's doing at the time. I mean, okay, you may not necessarily agree with the politics, But I know, from what she's told me, they have to go through such stringent checks in terms of their personal lives, etc. as well.
Of course.
That a lot of them are very proud of working for the civil service, but I think, especially with the current government and with the change of prime ministers and constant reshuffles, it's very unnerving, having to deal with
it must be
minister all the time.
Yeah, well, we got the low level example from that texter saying the last minister wanted to move everyone out of London, and the next minister wanted to know why all his staff were so far away. I mean, her staff are so far away, and of course, I don't know whether you're aware of this, Natalie, but there are whispers in the papers today coming from Francis Maud, remember him, that they should be free to appoint their own civil servants as opposed to having to hire, if you like, from the pool of independent, impartial professionals. They should be able to bring in their own ideologues, which they've kind of done already in most of the other jobs. Those lobby groups masquerading as think tanks have a conveyor belt into Conservative senior politicians' offices, but it doesn't change the nature of reality. It just prolongs the misery for the rest of the country. Oh, we're going to get our people from the Institute of Wizard Wheezers. They'll be able to deliver Brexit benefit. Okay, let's bring them in, sit them down, give them an office. 1 month later, right, what have you got? Bupkiss. I got nothing. There are no benefits, but we can never admit that publicly because our entire reputations depend on it. It's 12:03. Crikey. How did that happen? You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That was... I know you don't find this stuff as interesting as I do, but that was a masterclass, that last hour, in quality over quantity. I think we only took 3 or 4 calls, but every single one was an absolute zinger. And that is... I tell you, you've got to be doing this job for at least 10 years before you've got the guts to do a topic that is almost designed to attract a small number of callers of the utmost quality. So thank you to Richard and to B and to Natalie for saving my blushes. It means I'm bottling the next one. Partly because there was a story in the news there that I found more interesting than the one I had planned, and partly because I don't think I can do it. I don't think the producer's nerves will stand it if we do another hour where we're only really looking for 3 or 4 calls because the likelihood of people listening being qualified to comment is so slim. And that story is this. Polyamorous families provide a superior environment for children to grow up in, an academic has claimed. This is a Californian academic who argues persuasively that people in relationships with more than one person at the same time will provide a better environment in which to raise children. I'm not ready to do that as a topic yet. If I'd done it the other way around, I might have been. Also, what am I going to do if it turns out there are millions of polyamorists listening to this programme? It's a phenomenon with which I am not familiar. So remind me later in the week if we're looking for a little bit of not light relief. It's not, a story that we would treat with levity, but it's a story that is not necessarily about the spiralling of the plug hole that seems to concern us so much these days. And I guess that fits the next category as well. Did you know that some people thought that the emergency phone alert at the weekend was linked to vaccines? Apparently that there was a chip in the vaccine and the emergency phone alert was going to activate it. Now, I've got no idea. Don't look at me like that. I've got no idea how widespread that belief was. It's a former BBC technology correspondent, actually, who I noticed, and Will Guyot tweeted him, our technology dude, saying, amazed by hysteria about emergency phone alert generated by a combination of the mail and the wacko Bill Gates is putting a chip in your vaccine brigade. It is incredible that people believe that, and yet it's not incredible when you look at what other people have believed lately. And they're sort of popping up on GBBs, all manner of weird disinformation and conspiracy theory now being dressed in the clothes of plausibility or dressed in the clothes of normal news. And that took my breath away, the idea that people would honestly believe that your phone going a little bit bonkers at 2:59 yesterday, mine was a bit early, might have some sort of sinister subtext. The Mail went particularly crackers on this. I don't know how much of it you saw. Why are they trying to terrify us all at 3 p.m? They put that on their front page on the day that they announced Nadine Dorries as a new columnist. Hand on heart, what's more terrifying to you? Your phone buzzing for 30 seconds at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, or Nadine Dorries being let loose with a pen and a newspaper column? Yeah, well, exactly. But I don't know. I know that they're in the business of trying to terrify us and trying to enrage us and infuriate us at all times. But I don't know quite what I was supposed to get enraged or infuriated about with the emergency alarm. 7 minutes after 12 is the time. But I think it speaks to these figures that you just heard during the news about teenagers being at risk of rare diseases after a drop-off in vaccinations during the COVID pandemic. Now, you can't break down numbers like this. You don't know that a 7% drop in the number of 13 and 14-year-olds receiving a jab protecting them from tetanus, diphtheria and polio. You don't know how much of that is linked to weirdos on the internet claiming that vaccines are designed to damage us. Look, for the avoidance of doubt, almost all medicines and vaccines have negative side effects. Indeed, there are recorded cases in this country of coroners concluding that people have died as a consequence of taking the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, nobody denies that. When you talk about a vaccine being safe and effective, you are not denying the existence of negative side effects. If you have some Panadol in your bathroom cupboard, go and read it. Go and read the huge amount of small print that is contained with pretty much any active ingredient that you might take for medical reasons. You can die from drinking too much water. This ludicrous narrative that is abroad now, that because there are negative side effects to something, it is therefore bad. That would include everything from aspirin upwards or downwards. And forgive me, do not ring me if you are on this particular rabbit hole, okay? I don't want to hear it. You're bonkers, and I apologise for the fruity language, but it's a waste of your time and a waste of everybody else's. Get back on your Facebook, swap your stories with your equally deluded weird mates, and leave the rest of us alone. Because the thing about vaccines, the thing about immunology, the thing about herd immunity is that when you decide not to have it or not to get your child vaccinated, you potentially endanger everybody, including people who could end up being victims of your stupidity. All right? 9 minutes after 12 is the time. So you can't break it down. What has the fall in the number of people getting their children vaccinated against meningitis got its roots in the broader so-called vaccine hesitancy story that some very self-interested and self-important people managed to create during the COVID-19 crisis? And you know how we generally approach this subject. I'll remind you in a moment. The UK Health Security Agency has said that many of those who missed out on vaccines because of school closures in the pandemic have now been immunised. So they're confident that we're kind of breaking down that wing, if you like, of failure to uptake, failure in vaccine uptake. What I'm interested in is how much of the continuing level being below pre-pandemic levels is down to the broader vaccine hesitancy that has been very carefully nurtured by some deeply dishonest and self-interested people. 10 minutes after 12 is the time. And the way we deal with that, someone was sharing a dating app the other day which said, will not date vaccinated people. Now, you presume when you see something like that they're talking specifically about the COVID-19 vaccine. But how much of it has leached into vaccination in general? One of humanity's greatest triumphs against the fickleness of human existence, immunology, the things that would have killed our ancestors even as recently as 50 years ago will not kill us now because of vaccinology, because of immunology, because of science, because of doctors. But you can get a bunch of clicks on Twitter by claiming that you know better than the scientific establishment. So what I want to hear from you is about the people in your life. I saw one on Facebook yesterday. Her Facebook hadn't buzzed on my feed for a very, very long time. But for some reason, it snuck through the net yesterday. And I have a former friend who, still a friend, we haven't fallen out, I just don't see each other anymore, who was talking about vaccines in the context of the emergency security alert. And I couldn't believe my eyes. It's part of a kind of, I mean, it goes twofold. There's an idea that the people in charge are deliberately trying to damage us or deliberately trying to, what would the word be? There's some secret, that's what conspiracies are. There's some secret conspiracy to do us harm for unspecified reasons. and in unspecified ways. And then the other side of it is a kind of paranoia, a kind of, well, I guess unless you live it, unless you're down the rabbit hole, you can never fully understand exactly what it is. So here it is. You have people in your life, people that you care for, who have segued from vaccine hesitancy with regard to COVID-19 to vaccine hesitancy in general, including the tetanus, diphtheria and polio jabs and even the meningitis jab. How do you deal with them? 0345 60 60 973. And if you were previously in this camp, how do you get out of it? What is the... I mean, the problem with the 1 in a million chance is that the fear of being the 1 in a million is not illogical per se, but it is illogical in real terms. So how do you... Well, there's two questions here. The first is, do you reckon this drop is linked to anti-vaccine rhetoric being fairly widespread now online and on weird TV stations? 0345 60 60 973. And number two, how do you deal with it in your life? So my friend on Facebook, who I don't think has vaccinated their children, I don't think my children could play with her children if they were still of an age that was relevant, that mattered, if our social circles still intersected. You're looking at MMR, aren't you? You're looking at the meningitis one, you're looking at the tetanus, diphtheria and polio one. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with the certainty of a family member or a friend? There's two elements to this, isn't there? That you are somehow doing harm to your children by protecting the entire population from terrible diseases like meningitis and polio. And number two, they are not going to do it to their children. How do you respond to that? How do you accommodate that into your life? What does Christmas look like? I just want to know. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. It's coming up to 12:15. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. So teenagers are now at risk after a drop in vaccine take-up. They could be at risk, is the language correct, of rare diseases after a drop-off in vaccinations. UK health officials are warning about this. If it's in your life, what's it like? And what do you do? I'm just trying to imagine if like my kids' cousins or something hadn't been vaccinated, what would you do? And this is separate from the COVID conversation. That ship has not sailed, but it is in harbour. What do you do? If your sister or your brother-in-law is insisting that their children don't get the vaccinations, don't get the jabs, what do you do? 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. It's 12:15. 18 minutes after 12. I'm always intrigued by what the appeal is as well. What is it? So I don't know if you've got anyone like this in your life, or on Facebook in my case, and you have the occasional look at their feed and they're convinced that everything from tap water right through to meningitis vaccines is part of a secret government plan to do us harm. Ian points out this government couldn't organise a booze up in a brewery, let alone the grand conspiracy that these contrarians credit them with. That's why they then move on to World Economic Forum or Bilderberg Group or secret cabals dedicated to doing us harm for unspecified reasons. Julie is constantly looking after a son with profound health issues, and she reminds us that the moment an unvaccinated child with an infectious disease is taken to hospital, they gravely endanger all the other seriously ill children. We need education to make this socially unacceptable. Compulsory vaccinations for schools would help protect everyone. I think the BCG was compulsory when I was a kid. I certainly can't remember anybody opting out of it. But we live in strange times where strange people are promoted into strange places. So what's it like if one of them comes into your life? And what's the appeal of this kind of outlook on the world? 20 minutes after 12 is the time. Millen's in Barnet. Millen, what would you like to say?
The vaccine hesitancy stuff it started actually in the UK with a guy called Andrew Wakefield.
Yes, it did. But I think pre-COVID, we'd kind of seen, I mean, these are numbers that have gone down since 2019. So I don't think his fingerprints are on this phenomenon.
No, but the DNA of that movement has stayed within our culture for a long time. And the statistics show that the vaccine hesitancy went up and then it started coming down. But the thing is, what this is all inherently tied to is a distrust of government, of governing systems, a lot of it, as is most conspiracy. And when you look at the COVID pandemic and when you look at the actions of the government during the pandemic, when you start to lose faith in the people who are telling you to get vaccinated, you are far less likely to then get vaccinated, and you're far less likely to believe that they're doing something wrong with that vaccine.
Say that bit again. Sorry, Millen.
No, if the government during a pandemic is behaving in ways that contradicts their own advice, they're showing they don't really care about PPE that they're giving the people scared.
The mess in Downing Street and the I don't think it wasn't that they didn't really care about PPE, but they were in such a tizzy. They were like headless chickens running around throwing money at their mates and then buying loads of stuff that was actually unusable. It creates some grounds for skepticism and hesitancy in the minds of the public.
Right, yeah, and not only that, but then when you see their behaviour, parties and all that contradicts the things they're telling you to do, when you don't trust the people who are giving you the advice to take the vaccine, why would you take it? It's something, and given scientifically, it was rolled out very quickly. I'm not anti-vaccine myself, but I understand.
No, but if you're susceptible to skepticism or hesitancy, then having a chaotic and incompetent government in charge of it, while simultaneously boasting endlessly about what a brilliant job they're doing, it's suboptimal, isn't it?
Precisely.
Well, what you should have done is start a little rumour among these people that the government doesn't want you to take it. This is what Ian suggests, and then you sort of tap your nose and say they don't want you to take, and then they'd all go out and take it or get
exactly. The money involved in being anti-vax and the power you get from it is big.
Where does the money come from, Millen? I know the story of Andrew Wakefield, but latterly there's this sort of post-pandemic hesitancy regarding meningitis jabs or diphtheria and polio jabs. Where does the money come in there?
It comes from influence. Russell Brand is a good example of someone who's anti-vax, and the number of followers that he got and the sponsorships that you get from the more right-hand side of the media sphere increases massively when you take in these audiences. When you take in these anti-vax audiences, these highly conspiratorial audiences, you start getting funded by these shadowy people, the Charles Cox of the world, who have the money to spread these sort of ideologies.
Be a little bit careful naming names. I mean, I know that they fund all sorts of interesting organisations, but I don't know specifically what the impetus would be here to foment or to spread misinformation. I mean, in its earliest inception, it's relatively straightforward. If you're just on Twitter, you get a little dopamine kick out of popularity on Twitter, out of clicks and likes and shares, and you're usually hitting the sort of 50 or 60 mark, and you post something ridiculous and you get 2,000. You think, I might post something ridiculous again, and then you post something really ridiculous, you get 10,000. And so it's a weird self-generating, I know you know this, self-fulfilling phenomenon, but the ridiculousness for which you end up reaching, you'd think would give people pause. 24 minutes after 12. Thank you, Millen. It's Andrew in Cardiff says, my son's in his late 30s. He wouldn't have had his MMR jab if he'd had his way after reading far too much on the internet. Needless to say, he hasn't had any COVID jabs. We're out of touch these days. It's very sad as well, isn't it? And of course, it's not the case, as Keith suggests, not that one, Postman Keith. A few deaths among these idiots will encourage the rest to get their kids done. I don't think it does, and it's not necessarily them who die. As Julie reminds us, you go into a children's ward, even if the children there are vaccinated. Vaccination is not watertight. It's not foolproof. It just improves things. So people out there now saying, well, the COVID vaccine wasn't all that, it wasn't that. So why aren't people dying on the scale that they were dying when it was running through the country like a dose of salts then? What it does is it reduces the likelihood of you dying if you get it. First and foremost, I reduce the likelihood of getting it, hopefully, but reducing the likelihood of dying if you get it, crucially. It shouldn't be complicated. Tom's in Bexley. Tom, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James.
Hello, Tom.
Well, good afternoon. I think it's not just the internet, it's not Facebook.
No.
I think it's more to do with and it's a big admission for me, it's a bit shameful, it's laziness.
Just getting round to it.
Getting round to it.
It's like the eye tests. It's like the eye tests and the dentists.
Yeah. Oh, well, actually, we did them this week.
Well done.
But the schools organised it, and when the lockdown, they weren't in school. I've got my two youngest, we've got 7. My 2 youngest aren't polio vaccinated, and myself and my wife keep saying, we'll get round to it, we'll get round to it, we'll get round to it. And we haven't. And I think that's if the figures have gone down, I think that's...
I hope you're right.
To the mums in the playground, I think that's the big part of it, actually, just getting round to it, because we have to be active.
I'm going to give you a heads up that the next caller is going to paint a picture of what it is like to have polio in childhood. So you probably should pay attention to that.
And yeah, I know.
But I'm not having a swing at you, because I get it.
I'm slightly north of your age.
Yeah.
And I can remember kids in primary school wearing irons on their legs because of various different conditions. So, yeah, I'm completely aware of it. But it is, and I accept, shameful, absolutely shameful.
Well, it's a strong word.
I think it's Facebook, and I don't...
Well, no, it isn't for you.
Part of it.
I hope you're right. I hope that you are a bigger constituency than the people who've allowed the sort of COVID nonsense to leach into areas of other areas of immunology, other areas of vaccination. And my instincts are that you probably are a bigger constituency than this treatment of the story allows, because it makes more sense to me. It makes more sense to me that you just haven't got round to it yet. Or it's a bit of an argument for what they like to call the nanny state, isn't it? The stuff that people need actually a little bit of help, whether it's carrot or stick, just to get their backside in gear. And your backside remains resolutely not in gear.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jen.
You're very welcome, Tom. How old's your youngest?
4.
Blimey. And how old are you?
I don't know. I don't get it. What was I? Born in 63. I'm 60 this year.
Crikey.
My eldest is 20, getting first in Lancaster. And, yeah, my youngest is 4 in reception.
Well, good luck. I sometimes wonder, I've got a mate who's just become a dad again, a bit younger than you, a bit older than me, and there's a large part of me that feels tired on their behalf, is the kindest way to put it. Thank you, Tom. I hope he's right. I don't know. I mean, you're never going to be able to say, as I said at the very outset of this hour, you cannot break these numbers down. So you've got a 7% drop on one particular jab, another drop on the meningitis jab. I think a bigger drop on one of them, 13 to 14-year-olds. Before the pandemic, the uptake for one vaccine was 88% in England, and it's now down to 69% for 13 to 14-year-olds. How much of that is, I think, the perfectly plausible parental phenomenon of just not getting around to it, and when it's the school's responsibility, you don't need to, but if they weren't in school when they were supposed to have it, and the way that schools are overworked and understaffed now, who's going to be in charge of making sure that they deal with the backlog or the people that should have got it last year? I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. But it's a slightly more, it's a slightly less worrying phenomenon than the idea of vaccine reluctance or vaccine rejection creeping into all these other areas. Polio, meningitis, diphtheria, tetanus. What's the Menacwy one? MENACWY. I should have known this before I came on air, shouldn't I? But you get them free on the NHS to all 14-year-olds through your school. That's the tetanus, diphtheria and polio one. And I guess if you didn't get it in school, then, like Tom suggested, you may not have got around to it at all. As promised, Steve in Liverpool will bring us, provide us with a little reminder of why these vaccines are so important shortly. And then you'll tell me how you deal with someone, if indeed you have this issue in your life, persuaded that science-led interventions designed to prolong humanity's existence are actually bad. 0345 6060 973. It's 12:30. Amelia Cox is here now with the headlines. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. It's this is no criticism of Millen, who rang in earlier, but it goes way beyond Andrew Wakefield, who achieved infamy for his claims about the MMR vaccine, subsequently completely dismissed. But even Edward Jenner, who's sort of perceived as the godfather of vaccination, also encountered similar sort of skepticism or attacks. This text here tells me that even when the smallpox vaccination was first brought in, there were cartoonists portraying the notion that it would turn you into a cow or something like that. It's a fascinating area of study. It really is. And as with almost everything that we find shocking in the modern world, there is nothing new under the sun. That idea of people's susceptibility to being told that other people wish them harm is as old as humanity itself, isn't it? So Jenner pioneered the concept of vaccines, came up with the smallpox vaccine, but encountered in his lifetime the kind of conduct that people like Chris Whitty and others were encountering during the COVID crisis. And I know I speak about it as if it's over, and I know a lot of you are reminding me that it isn't, but you understand why and how I'm saying what I'm saying. Let's go to Steve, who's in Liverpool. You picked up the phone for quite a personal reason today, Steve.
Yeah. Just on the vaccines, I was born in 1953,
right.
And the first 3 or 4 years of my life was perfectly normal, and then I got polio. I didn't get it as bad as some of the other kids.
Right.
It affected my right side from my waist down. I've got about 30% mobility in my right leg, but between the age of 4 and 13, I had 6 corrective operations because of the polio on my right leg. And then at the age of 13, I was discharged. Up to 13, I had to walk around in a caliper. And then from the age of 13 up to, say, in my 50s, I relatively lived quite a normal life.
Yeah.
But because I was so reliant on my left side, since my 50s, I've had to have a new knee, a new hip. My L4, L5 and L6 discs were worn out. They've had to be repaired. And this is all because of the polio. And I just don't understand people. There's a vaccine out there. People don't understand how badly it's affected my life. And my life hasn't been affected as badly as some of the other poor kids.
No, of course.
When I was in hospital, I was in for nearly 12 months. I know it's all changed now. There was iron lungs, kids in iron lungs because of the polio. And
it must leave you even more baffled than it does the rest of us then, when you hear people sort of suggesting that it's all part of some conspiracy, or that it's all exaggerated, or that it's all nonsense.
It's a no-brainer. I've got 3 sons, 28, 30, and a 13-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
I'm 70 this year, and he was.
It's the old dad's brigade today, isn't it? Ringing in.
I can honestly say, when he was born, I was looking up to be able to retire. I'm bringing him up this 13 years.
Oh, lovely.
I've been the best 13 years of my life.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, yeah. I mean, so
because I was at work for the other 2 older lads. I wasn't able to spend as much time with them as, I basically, my wife's always had a better job than I have.
Sure.
She's still at work now. And for the last 13 years, I've been at home bringing him up, and it's been an absolute joy.
Oh, that's lovely.
If you're fit and healthy,
why not?
Do it, just do it. But on the polio, which happened to me, get the vaccinations. Don't hesitate. If you're children or any vaccination, there may be a 0.1% of something bad happening, but
there always is. But that's the point, isn't it? It's a weird one, because the alternative is to increase the risk of getting it, or to increase the and then of course increasing the risk of giving it to other people who might not be able to cope. Steve, lovely stuff, mate. Thank you. 12:38 is the time. It is a fascinating area of study, although I'm leaning now, looking at the screen, towards the idea that this particular uptake drop, despite the warnings of the UK Health Security Agency, may have more to do with schedules and motivation than it does to do with actual hesitancy or skepticism, although it was the people responsible for releasing the figures who floated the possibility that we might have seen a sort of cross-fertilisation of vaccine hesitancy. Consultant epidemiologist at the UKHSA said children and young people who had missed out on their teenage vaccines should contact their school nurse, their school immunisation team, or their GP surgery. So that would be Tom, wouldn't it? I think it was Tom, our earlier caller. She adds, these vaccines offer the best protection as young people start their journey into adulthood and mixing more widely, whether going to college, starting work, travelling, or going to summer festivals. So there is the official advice. If you've missed one, or you think you've missed one, talk to your school nurse, your school immunisation team, or your GP surgery. 12:39 is the time. Simon is in Balham. Simon, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James.
Hello,
one of your previous callers talked about being too lazy to get around to having his kids vaccinated. There's another effort barrier that comes into play here, I think, which is the online effort barrier. People like easy answers. They don't like complicated answers, and they don't like having to go to the effort of doing extra research, to go and look at different websites, different sources, go and make some effort. And that effort barrier, I think, is the thing that gets in the way of people getting it into their heads that vaccines are actually not as damaging as they think they are. They're not.
But there's a chicken and egg problem here, though, because you'd have had to. I'll use the word advisedly. You'd have had to have done some quotes, research end quotes, to end up in a place where you think that they're bad.
Well, what I think about that, James, is that it's a bit like the eye of Sauron looking from that big tower and finding you. You know, it's you click on one link, and I've done this just to see what's out there. You click on one link, and suddenly the algorithms kick in. And before you know it, the fire hose of, I'm not going to say the word, is directed at you.
Yeah.
And suddenly every link you see on Twitter, on Facebook, everywhere is suddenly all about the next crazy person telling you the next crazy
chicken
thing
coops.
About, whatever. Yeah, exactly.
I looked at chicken coops last night, and now my feed is full of them. Facebook, Twitter, everyone knows that I'm looking for chicken coops. I'm being bombarded with chicken coops. Chicken coops to the left of me, chicken coops to the right of me. So if I'd been looking up the stuff you're talking about, I'd be bombarded with that. And if I was susceptible to that nature of bombardment, it's coming to me. I'm not going to it. Yep. So in fact, that effort barrier is in place. There's no effort involved in being bombarded.
None whatsoever. None whatsoever.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Is there an antidote for it, to coin a phrase?
My antidote has always been, and I've been an advocate of this for a very long time, is to teach critical thinking in schools from a very young age.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I used to belong to an organisation that existed for a long time in England. I'm not sure if it's still around, which was it had a very long name, but it was the Society for the Advancement of Philosophical Education for Children.
Oh, how lovely idea.
And it was basically an idea that they were trying to get it into the curriculum in England and Wales to teach kids basic critical thinking from the age of 6. It never made it into the curriculum except in private schools, but it would have been lovely.
It would have been lovely. It's never too late. It sort of puts me in mind of the attempts to denigrate education as well that are in place now from certain wings of certain political movements. The idea that having a degree is somehow a mark of Cain, or that pointing out some statistical realities about voting habits, for example, of educated people is somehow condescending or smug. It's almost as if there's some sort of plan in place. Thank you for that, Simon. Let's go to Danny, and I can tell you Edward Lucas is going to talk to us shortly. This is a remarkable piece that actually ties in with a lot of what we've been talking about today in the Times that he has written about what looks like, I think the headline suggests Soviet-era tactics being deployed in the civil service to stop people who have ever criticised you think, we'll talk to the fella and it won't be as bad as it sounds, because the idea that Jacob Rees-Mogg introduced rules that prevent people who've ever criticised the government on social media from sharing their expertise from a whole range of fields with civil servants, you'd think even by the standards of this lot, that's probably a bridge too far. But then you go, so we'll find out more about that shortly. Danny's in Winchester. Danny, what would you like to say?
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion about why people decide to sort of take on anti-vaccination views. And it's something I've actually been looking at for quite a while. Some of that. I'm a trustee of a evidence-based medicine charity as well. And I've written a couple of times in things like New Scientist about, people who decide to opt for alternative medicine rather than for sort of conventional medicine, and specifically when it comes to vaccines. I think there's two issues. There's firstly, vaccinations and a lot of modern medicine is a victim of its own success, because now you don't see as many children with measles, and when it used to be very common before vaccination.
Oh, gosh.
People were aware that you'd go blind, you could have brain damage, you could even die.
Yes.
And now that you've never seen anyone with measles, you're more worried about the potential damage that the vaccine might do, because you're not aware of the common and potential damage that the disease could do. And we see this with pet owners as well. There's diseases in the UK that dogs don't get anymore, and people start to worry about the potential side effects of the vaccination.
So if we still had children walking around in calipers, or we still had, bereavements that were commonplace, then the almost, for want of a better phrase, the PR that vaccination needs would be done naturally, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I'm probably slightly out of date now. Because last time I looked was 5 or 6 years ago, but there's about 300,000 children a year going blind worldwide from measles, in countries where vaccination isn't common. Whereas, when's the last time anyone in the UK heard of a child going blind from measles?
Yeah,
it's really rare. And I think the other thing as well is both doctors and vets at the moment, we're really, really understaffed, and we've got a lot of time pressure. And I think some of the problem is when people come in with concerns and they feel like the doctor or the vet is sort of feeling rushed, they don't have the time to address their concerns. And sometimes people feel like they can't sort of question the doctor with a load of other questions when they feel like they need to just get in and out and not take up the doctor's time.
Yes.
And they maybe didn't get to sort of get the reassurance they needed that the vaccines, are safe, or, have a discussion about what the actual risks are. And then if you go home and you're feeling a bit uneasy and you feel like your concerns weren't addressed, that's when you start Googling, is it? And that's when you start finding, you're going down these sort of conspiracy theory rabbit warrens, and had you had a bit more time with the doctor, or had you had the confidence to ask for reassurance or ask what the evidence is, you might not have gone home and felt the need to go and check it out, for yourself. And then you get, inaccurate and some sort of very dubious information that gets you really worried.
Yeah, that's what I like about that explanation, is that it's kind. I'm afraid I haven't been very kind in my conversations about this over the last few years, because I don't feel much kindness towards the kind of people who rise way above the parapet. But of course, once again, it's contempt for the con men, compassion for the conned territory. And although the public liars, the people who are performatively spreading disinformation deserve our contempt, your explanation of how people might end up believing things that are objectively wrong or ridiculous is a lot kinder, and I thank you for it. So the doctor is overworked, understaffed, simply hasn't got time to take 10 minutes to put someone's mind at ease. You go home, you Google it, the algorithm is set up, as the earlier caller explained, in such a way that you're going to be bombarded with misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of it's going to look plausible. It's coming from what looks like a proper studio, or what looks like a proper page, internet page, or a proper organisation. And then you find a couple of people who've got a couple of qualifications that look a bit medical, even if they've got nothing to do with immunology and vaccines, and that's it. It's game over. You're going to start believing them rather than the people who've spent their life studying the subject that you're confused about.
What's really interesting as well is that people tend to trust information from other people they can relate to, rather than from someone who's an expert. And that's one reason when you're doing health campaigns, like whether you often get a mother to talk about why they vaccinated their child, because other people will identify with that better. Or, in the veterinary world, we might get someone who's, dog's got diabetes, or, I don't know, someone else who owns Labradors, but rather than having an immunologist or, a specialist saying this is why you should do it. Because it's the same with politics. If you want to change people's sort of viewpoint, often they're, their kind of attitudes are closely tied to their personal values, rather than their educational level. So when it comes to communicating with people and trying to change minds, and I find this, whether it's in politics or whether it's sort of being a vet, this is going to sound really cheesy, but I do quite a lot of teaching communication skills for vet students. And one thing we say is people don't care how much you know; they want to know how much you care, and that's the point where if they feel that you've got their best interests at heart, they trust the information that you're giving them. And that's when you can really get people on board and get them engaged with either health campaigns or, your local political campaign or whatever it is you're trying to do. Whereas if you tell them, because you're an expert and you've got a PhD and other qualifications, why they're wrong, it just gets their back up. And you find that these other people who are spreading misinformation, often making a lot of money out of it as well, they really are, like you said, they do deserve contempt, but they're really good at making people feel like they're really good at engaging. They're good at making people feel like that they care about them, that they're worried about public health or whatever it is. And they seem to do a better job of spreading that information than sort of professionals do.
That's a beautiful analysis. No, that's so. Tell me that line again, because I'm going to nick it. How much they care? What is it? Care and know.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. My
Tell me the line. Tell me the line.
When I first graduated as a vet, he said the best advice I can give you is people don't care how much you know. They want to know how much you care.
Don't care how much you know. They want to know how much you care. Crikey. Anyone else thinking of the referendum at this point in the conversation? Or is that's just the way my warped brain works? Thank you, Daddy. That was brilliant. 12:49 is the time. 12:53 is the time. I am a little bit partial to tweets that say, I hope James talks about this later, because they are generally... I mean, in the same way that I'm very unpartial, if that's a word, to tweets, I bet he doesn't talk about this. I bet he doesn't talk about Diane Abbott. Because you're an idiot. But the first people would say, I hope he talks about this, because I know his programme and it seems like the sort of thing he might care about. They're actually very helpful, because I miss stuff. We it's not the BBC. There's only 2 of us putting this programme together every morning and 4 of us putting it out into the airwaves. So we do miss stuff. And I might have missed this. A piece by Edward Lucas, the Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate, in the Times today, a column in the Times today, which appears under the headline, Rees-Mogg's blacklist is positively Soviet. And it was the use of the word Soviet, obviously, that drew the eye. Edward joins me now, and I mean, I know you don't write the headlines, but you're comfortable with the comparison, Edward.
Yes, because I lived behind the Iron Curtain in a world where disloyalty and defiance were really dangerous and potential career killers and had other consequences. And I never thought that I would feel the same thing in this country. And what my column's about is an expert in a arcane bit of science, which is very important for national security, who has been blacklisted by the Cabinet Office because he tweets, and I don't want to give his name away, but he tweets and sort of general sort of letting off steam tweets about Trump and Suella Braverman and other things. But that's nothing to do with his field of expertise. And he was invited to a conference, not actually even a government conference, but a public body conference, something that we pay for as taxpayers. And he then got this letter disinviting him, saying, we have checked your social media feed and it includes material critical of the government. We have no option but not to disinvite you. And I just thought that's absolutely disgusting. That's the opposite of the way this country should work.
And I mean, it's incredible. I may read it, if I may, in a little more detail. And you've seen this, Edward. You've seen this communication from the Cabinet Office, is it?
It's from the organisation.
Okay, but they're subject to the Cabinet Office rules that are described here. So rules introduced by the Cabinet Office in 2022 specify that the social media accounts of potential speakers must be vetted to check whether these people have ever criticised government officials or government policy. The vetting process is impartial and purely evidence-based. The check on your social media has identified material that criticises government officials and policy. It is for this reason that I am afraid that we have no choice and must cancel your invitation. I mean, I often opine on this programme about cancel culture being a myth that has been invented by some fairly irresponsible people in the hope of indulging in a little bit of scaremongering. I hadn't realised that not only does it exist, but it exists in the heart of the government that's constantly complaining about other people doing it.
I think the big difference is that you can imagine a university saying we don't want X or we don't want Y, and if you don't like one university, well, there's always another one you can go to. What's so sinister about this is that for an expert, being blacklisted by your own government is actually quite bad for business. So this is actually attacking people's livelihoods and their professional fortunes, and there's no appeal appeal. We don't even know what these rules are.
It's quite incredible.
These rules were never debated by Parliament. They were never approved by Parliament. We don't know what the rules are. We don't actually know who implements them, and there's no appeal against it. It's a completely secret process, and at the end of it, you are in this kind of limbo. And for people who make their money, consulting for government or giving speeches to government, this is something they're going to bear in mind. They're going to think, well, perhaps I'd better not say anything on Twitter because I get £600 a day for teaching trainee police officers about different forms of Islam or something. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we
and in fact, the more recondite the field of expertise, the more valuable the advice or the testimony becomes, really.
And if the government's cutting itself off from the advice of anybody who disagrees with them, they will end up like the communist bureaucrats of Eastern Europe, who ended up knowing nothing and being toppled by the angry crowds.
Hence the headline. And I should add, just in their defence, that on this occasion, your contact had agreed to waive his or her customary fee because they considered the subject matter to be so important. And the road leads to Jacob Rees-Mogg's door, does it, Edward?
Well, the only knowledge we have of this is an interview in the FT with someone called Friends of Jacob Rees-Mogg. One might wonder how big that category really is, but I better not say that because I don't want to get on this blacklist.
No, of course. No, be careful.
But it's never been, and that's really all we know about this. And he's there. He was then the Cabinet Office Minister, and defends. And the worry was that you had religious extremists being invited into government and giving talks to sort of the civil service Muslim network or something. But anyway, it's clearly nothing to do with the way it's being applied is quite wrong. Now he's gone, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I've written to Jeremy Quinn, the Cabinet Office Minister, and have had no reply from the Cabinet Office on
asking what are the criteria for reviewing the accounts, what safeguards are involved, what right of appeal do victims have, how widely are these tests applied.
So I'm going to get questions put down in Parliament. I'm going to put in the Freedom of Information request, because this guy's actually my constituent. He lives here in central London. He's one of the people, if I'm an MP, I'll be representing. And I'm used to picking up very important things about noise and mess and safety and all things people, buses, all the stuff we worry. But this is democracy is actually in danger if this happens. It's a really big scandal.
It is. It's a very big story. Thank you for bringing it to our attention and keep us posted if you hear back from Jeremy Quinn or indeed if there's anything we can do to help. It's incredible, actually. The more one reads into it, the more one listens to Edward Lucas, the Times columnist and Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate. And the parallels normally balk slightly at words like Soviet or Nazi in headlines, but on this occasion, I think if the cap fits. That is it from me for today. Thank you, Edward. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also, gee whiz, rewind live radio. That is actually quite exciting. Where you'll probably rewind and think, did he really say that? Oh, my God. Where you'll find all of LBC's shows. So do check that out from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty is in the house. 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 Fogarty is in